Okay, good morning, everybody. It's Saturday morning, and you might see another video later with some of my homeless friends. Sometimes I'll go and visit Brother Dave will feed today, and I wanted to encourage them, but if I forget to do it, let me do it right now. I've been working on a lot of I uploaded Acts or posted Acts 8, and then I do other work on Saturday. There's a process of organization of flash drives and all types of stuff in order to kind of do all of our little website things and all. But it's a process, it's an order. And then I realized, I was saving to a particular flash drive, and it was the wrong one. It took about maybe 40 minutes or an hour to correct it, just copying and pasting a lot of videos. Not a lot, actually. Maybe there were 40 that were on the wrong flash drive. It took like an hour to do that. But the amount of time it takes to produce all that, this could be instructive in the sense of, there's various titles I could give to this. Diary of a Mad Black Woman. Now, I don't want to be racist. This week, let me just talk a little bit about issues on both sides of the aisle. As a news watcher, this week we had an incident that's kind of famous. There's a lady that's on Fox News, Judge Jeanine Pirro. Now, I've seen her, and of course, you would say she's hard right, okay? But she's kind of for those that are on that side of the aisle, she's kind of got a popular show. And then she was invited on a show that I had never watched in my life. And I think if anybody ever watches those types of shows, you're wasting time because you're not learning. It's like a gossip show. It's called The View. NBC, one of the broadcasts, I forget who, but it's, it would be like gossip. If you went and had a bunch of, please, it's not degrading to women, but if you had a lot of women or men just sitting around gossiping, talking, that's all that is. And so you don't educate yourself on that stuff, which is much of some of the media. But anyway, Justice Jeanine Pirro was on. They got into a tiff. Whoopi Goldberg stopped the show. And then in the hallway, Jeanine Pirro says, when Whoopi Goldberg saw her in the hallway, get the F out of this building, get the F. We saw Robert De Niro, who I like him as an actor, at one of the other things I never watched in my life, Emmy Awards or Academy Awards, things that mean zero. And he said, F Trump, F Trump. All right. Granted, I understand we have people on all these sides of the aisle. What's the danger? If you looked at the history of the 20th century, that's why I said this could be something that would have maybe future value. The greatest war, and I use that term not in a good way, but World War II was a tragic thing that took place in the history of men. But in World War II, most of you are familiar with it, and a lot of you have been taught through our history that the United States, when we entered the war, because obviously we had the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which allowed us to enter into the war. And the American public did not want to. There was much that you hear in discussions today. There were many American citizens, I've seen clips on it, videos on it, who said, we don't want to be in that war. We don't want to fight Europe's wars. That's what a lot of Americans, it was like very high, 80-something% of the American population before we entered World War II. Therefore, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, a surprise attack, a day that lives in infamy, most of you are familiar, that allowed Roosevelt to enter the war. Now, there's questions in history whether or not we permitted it, whether we knew ahead of time, and it seems like we did know, but we let it go on so we could get into the war. Now, most of us view Churchill as a wonderful, heroic figure, okay? Winston Churchill, and Hitler in Germany, and the Nazi war machine, they were indeed attempting to take over the world, which it looks like they might have done it. Most Americans believe that when the United States entered the war, and there's famous battles that we know in our history, that we kind of won the war. But if you looked at, the whole history of that time, and there are many historians who believe Stalin, okay, the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, many historians believe that Russia won that war. You say, John, that's unbelievable. You see how we get manipulated? How many people died in World War II? About 70 million. That's tragic. Let me ask you, those that are veterans and those that have followed history, do you know how many people the United States and Britain lost in World War II? The casualties. Under 500,000. Under 500,000 Americans and British died. Civilians and military, okay? Do you know how many Russians died in World War II? Now remember, there's about 70 million people who died in that World War. About 27 million, okay? Almost half of all the deaths in World War II were suffered by the Russians, okay? That gives you some perspective. There were various battlefronts that the United States, Roosevelt and Churchill and the Allies, that we decided to fight on. Various battlefronts. And some of those decisions were made, they're famous names that we know in history. I forget now often. But they were made because it was almost like we were avoiding a direct conflict with Hitler's army. But yet, Russia had the direct conflict. And their famous battles of Stalingrad and others. Many Russians died. Now, why give this history? After that war, there was decisions based. Winston Churchill very much had believed, there was a lot of language used that it will be the English-speaking world, the Anglo world that will be in charge. A lot of language that you'd be surprised. And then there were questions because when we had to divide up areas, Roosevelt, and then when he died, you had Truman, of course. But it had to do with a fear of the Russians. After that war, then you began having within the United States, the Western world, you had sort of like the Red Scare. And some of you remember having to go under your tables at school and hide and, go under things because of bomb shelters and all. And so what happened at that point, Dwight Eisenhower, the great Dwight Eisenhower, he was the one that had coined the phrase, the military-industrial complex. The planes were just flying over. I live by a naval air station. But what he said was, are there people in society, influential people, the deep states, whatever terms we use, do they want the military-industrial complex, which Eisenhower coined that phrase, to continue? There's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of jobs and a lot of people make money building war weapons. And so the trend of the 20th century was maybe we need to have an enemy to justify. Now, Churchill and Truman and American presidents following, I'm not saying they all did things out of all that motivation, But there began a trend within nations that said, eventually we called it a Cold War. And we know the whole history of John Kennedy standing down Nikita Khrushchev and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was indeed, that was the stage was set. And many people forget that the Russians were major allies of the United States and Britain. And in some of the meetings that Stalin had, Joseph Stalin had, sitting down with Roosevelt and Churchill, and some of those decisions, it was like Russia felt they were now being kind of targeted as the new world enemy, though they were very responsible for the defeat of Hitler and his Nazi army. Strange, isn't it? But then you began having The Russians Are Coming, the famous movie that came out when I watched as a kid. The Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. And then you had that whole Red Scare, if you will. And then our country even went through a time where we had congressional hearings. Hollywood people were coming before we talk about McCarthyism. And it was, we want to investigate. Are you associated with the Communist Party? Walt Disney was one of the people that said, as they had all these people, the actual guy, Walt Disney, the whole founder of Disney World and everything, he agreed we should not have communists working in Hollywood and so forth. And there were others that, so you had this kind of thing. The Russians, the communists. Why is that important to see? What we're seeing in our media, Mr. Trump had the infamous now meeting in Helsinki, Finland, with Vladimir Putin in 2018. And of course, Mr. Trump said things maybe that weren't the best. And then you had Democrats in Congress and media and others, John Brennan, accusing Mr. Trump of a crime that he should be executed for. I think Mr. Brennan should immediately lose his security clearance. And he's working for a media company right now, has that security clearance. These men were known to have leaked classified information to media over the last few years. And he made a charge, along with others in the media, that would mean we should have Mr. Trump executed. Never forget that. Everybody that has said that Trump committed treason in the Helsinki summit is calling for a charge against him that would lead to his execution. Remember that. And so after this summit Mr. Trump had with Putin, Democrats and others began saying, let's get the interpreters of that meeting between heads of state and let's grill them. That everything you said, every type of trying to work things out, we want to get that. We might hold the interpreters accountable. We might. And I think that because of the way the media is trending right now in an irresponsible way, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. People forgot. Whenever you hear Mr. Trump say things like, why didn't Obama do something? Why? Look, don't be tricked. Not by Trump. Don't be tricked in general. What he's saying is everything that the country, the media, is in an uproar about, calling for charges where the president will be executed by firing squad. Many in the media are doing that over things that actually have been going on. Things that have been going on. I do not justify Russian meddling in U.S. elections, but you know, I thought the other day the real threat in that arena is China. And sure enough, a few days later, some of our national security people said that. Because China's they're different than, they attack through cyber attacks businesses and stealing copyrights, things of that nature. And I see them trending back into the whole Red Scare thing. I see them unaccountable in some of the media outlets. What you saw in the Whoopi Goldberg example, when she was cursing, "Get the F out of bed." You're seeing that in the media, okay? It's like an MSNBC thing, it's a CNN thing, it's ongoing, it's nonstop. And I don't think they realize the danger of it. And in a way, they probably are playing into the hands of people who not only are behind the military-industrial complex, people who have a lot of reasons they want to keep that fomented. But you might really be leading up to a hot war. Russia's economy is not really good. Part of the reasons is things we've done. The Obama thing, let me say, when Mr. Obama, I did not dislike him, nor do I dislike him now. But when they had questions about the whole Russian meddling thing, they knew this was going on. None of this was a surprise. But they also made statements like, if anybody would believe, Mr. Obama said, if anybody would believe that anybody could really impact our elections, that's never going to happen. So the media at that time, along with Mr. Obama, along with everyone that's in an uproar now about Russian meddling, they were happy to just leave it the way it was. Yeah, we'll deal with it, but it's been going on. It's nothing new. It's been happening. Then why the outrage now? You see, at that time, they thought Hillary Clinton was going to win. Everybody, most pundits thought that. And they didn't want to foment. And so if you had a Trump or anybody else at that time say, wait a minute, the meddling, the this and that, they would, oh, come on. If anybody, Mr. Obama said, if anybody believes that our elections and democratic process could really be affected, Mr. Obama said, you're not living in the real world. Because he was critiquing Trump, who was not elected yet, for his questioning about our elections. So all the media, all the Whoopi Goldbergs, all the Joe Scarboroughs, they were all laughing like, oh, if anybody thinks that anybody could meddle in U.S. elections, you're a conspiracy nut. That was the mantra of the media. Then why the sudden change? Trump got in, Hillary did not. Now, we're calling for charges to have a president executed. Mr. Brennan, other media heads, we're calling for the possibility of a World War III. Serious Democrats, if you want to call them that, not all, serious-minded people are calling that we're going to get the translator between Putin and Trump. We're going to grill him before Congress. Maybe we're going to have you executed too, if you could. This whole thing is a mass hysteria that's not looking at history. Why did you mention that figure of the Russians lost 27 million people in World War II, and the U.S. and Britain lost under 500,000? Because maybe some of you never heard that before. And I might be 1,000 or two off, but that's the number. And about 70 million. So the Russians almost lost half of all the casualties in World War II. What does that mean? It meant that they were very responsible for the defeat of Hitler. But then there was that trend. There was that Red Scare. There was now the enemy's communism. And the 20th century went through that, and that's where you had those movies. And the media, because of their political rage, are going down trend lines that are not good, There was a Podesta man, this is being discussed. Out of all these investigations, John, that are going on, did the people, the Muellers, and the deep state, if you will, and the Strzok's, did they actually cover for criminal activity by the other side of the aisle? Of course they did. I remember when they were investigating Hillary and things like that, they gave Uma Abedin and others, they gave them immunity when the FBI and CIA and all had them come in. Then they destroyed the laptops where would be evidence. And when you give immunity, you think there's going to be a case. No, they just kind of did their own part to cover up. And they did that again this week with Mr. Podesta. Out of all the wrongdoing with Paul Manafort and the Ukrainian lobbyists and all of these many things, and Hillary's involvement with all these types of things, there were people on the Democratic side of the aisle who were connected. The Podesta group, okay? Tony Podesta and somebody else, but they were just as guilty as Paul Manafort in some of the actual things that had to do with why Manafort is in prison right now. He was in solitary confinement. One media outlet reported he confessed to the charges of 5 murders, manslaughter. That came out a few weeks ago. Then they said it was a mistake. No, it was wrong, but they did it. His family's in fear of his life. The husband's being held. I guess he has children. And then the children watch the world news. Manafort, your father's not only in solitary, not only he might get murdered in prison, not only are we going after you, Manafort, your family, and everybody else, because of these high crimes of Ukraine, your lobbying and all this, but then we reported on national media, which is fake news, that you confessed to killing 5 people. And then it was just somebody behind the scenes said, let's do it. Let's have his kids kill themselves, his wife going nuts. Now, all of those types of crimes we have him in there for right now were the same things that Hillary's people called the Podestas did. And Mr. Mueller, this week, they were investigating the Podestas on the Democratic side for all of these same crimes. And he gave them immunity. Mr. Mueller gave the Podestas immunity for the crimes that they committed. So one man is facing life in prison, and if it's treason, let's execute it. And the other, in the same thing, is running scot-free still. Now, the public's not ignorant. Do you think the media, the radicals on the Whoopi Goldberg types, Maxine Waters or whatever, do you think, John, that their reason? No. I would just simply say you got to make sure, those of you that are voting in these upcoming elections, I'm not justifying Republicans or Trump, but I'm saying that party, the historic Democratic Party, is gone off the rails in their hysteria. And I am not a conservative, okay? Nor am I a liberal. In some views, I'm both. I'm not a Republican, nor am I a Democrat. But that party, in collusion with this media, are going after people that are political enemies and even calling for their execution. And these former guys like John Brennan are actually still working for the media. They're in private business. They're no longer government officials, yet they carry top secret security clearance, still have access to all types of stuff that they can illegally leak to their bosses or to their media enterprises. And what to the Democrats, what do they want to do? The Adam Schiffs, they want all that to continue. They want to make sure you give immunity to the Podestas, make sure any illegal connections when Mrs. Clinton and the DNC illegally colluded with the Russians by obtaining a Russian dossier, hiring an illegal expert spy by the name of Steele to have actual illegal contacts with the Russians because he was not being a paid lobbyist, he was not registered as a lobbyist. All of those are illegal crimes of illegal collusion by the Democrats, the whole Podesta crowd. All of those are illegal crimes by illegal collusion with Russians to obtain information called the Russian dossier in order to illegally influence a U.S. election. All of that is known and has been used as evidence to go after the other party. So, maybe you got a little history lesson. Look up those numbers that I gave you, okay? It's important that you look them up. And this is just the first update, okay? God bless everybody. I don't know what I'm going to title this.